A photograph taken in the spring of 1945 in a place that even in the wildest dreams no one ever imagined they would set foot. The faces of young American soldiers, uniforms creased and worn, hollow-eyed and exhausted after months of endless life and death struggle. There they stood on a massive stone structure perched precariously atop the snow-covered peaks of the German Alps, looking down into the vast, deep valley below. The place they stood was Kehlsteinhaus, known to the world as the Eagle's Nest. This was not merely a residence, it was the supreme symbol of the absolute power and arrogance of the Nazi German Reich. But look closely at the men in that photograph. They did not wear the insignia of those at the top. They were not heroes stepping out of epic novels. They were simply ordinary young men called up from every village and city across America. Some came from remote farms in Pennsylvania. Some left poor working-class neighborhoods in Boston or quiet roads in the American South. They came together in a small unit designated Company E, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the famed 101st Airborne Division. People knew them simply as Easy Company. And there is one question, the single question that runs through everything we must ask ourselves looking at this photograph. What brought these utterly ordinary men across thousands of miles to stand atop the proud summit of their enemy? To find the answer for Easy Company, the reel of history must be rewound to the early years of the 1940s. At that time, the entire planet was being swallowed by a dark storm with no end in sight. It all began in 1939, when Adolf Hitler launched his devastating war across Europe. In less than 2 years, the marching boots of Nazi Germany had trampled most of the old continent. Glamorous Paris fell. The isolated island of Britain endured relentless bombing. Behind the front lines, millions of Jews and other peoples were being herded into concentration camps, slaughtered in the darkest corners of humanity. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America still chose to stand outside the war. The vast majority of Americans at the time believed they had no reason to spill their children's blood over a land thousands of miles away. But that false peace shattered completely on the fateful morning of December 7, 1941. A lethal strike from Japanese aircraft hit the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans had fallen. The very next day, Washington officially declared war on Japan. Just days later, Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States. A nation that had wrapped itself in a neutral safe zone, suddenly drawn into the heart of the greatest conflict in human history. America's war machine immediately triggered full mobilization. Everywhere, millions of young men lined up in long queues at recruitment offices to volunteer for the front. And from that surging tide of humanity, the first building blocks of Easy Company began to take shape. By 1942, recognizing the new situation, the U.S. Army began expanding a branch that was still extremely young and fraught with risk, the Airborne Forces. The concept sounded romantic and adventurous. Fly over the enemy's head, leap into open air, and land deep behind enemy lines before the infantry could arrive. But the reality on the battlefield was an entirely different story, brutal and isolating. A paratrooper needed not just courage, but extraordinary physical endurance, an iron will, and the ability to fight independently while surrounded, things an ordinary infantryman could hardly imagine. In August 1942, the 101st Airborne Division was born, bearing the emblem of the Screaming Eagles. and within that division's ranks, the 506th Paratroop Infantry Regiment was chosen to establish its base at a place that would later become legendary, Camp Toccoa, Georgia, right at the foot of the towering Karahi Mountain. On this harsh, barren ground, Easy Company was officially born. Yet the reputation of a unit is not determined by administrative paperwork, but by the very people who give it its soul. Easy Company was fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, depending on one's perspective, to have within its ranks some truly extraordinary characters.
The first face that must be mentioned is Richard Winters, a young man from Pennsylvania born in 1918. Winters always carried an air of calm, iron discipline and an unusual quietness. Raised in a poor rural area and a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College, Winters entered the military not out of a desire for glory or bloodlust, but out of a sense of duty. No drinking, no smoking, no loud display, Winters chose to stay back and observe. But it was precisely this stillness and his razor-sharp judgment under pressure that would later become a lifeline for dozens of men on the brutal battlefield. The complete opposite of Winters' quiet demeanor was his closest friend, Lewis Nixon. Nixon was born into the luxury of a wealthy New York family, carrying an elegant, witty manner but also a heavy drinking habit. A graduate of the prestigious military academy West Point, Nixon possessed a natural gift for intelligence work, a sharp weapon that Winters would rely on heavily during the grueling campaigns across Europe. Two men, two completely opposite poles, yet the war forged them into an inseparable pair, balancing each other on the edge of life and death. However, before Winters rose to take ultimate command, Easy Company had to pass through a crucible created by another man, Herbert Sobel. Sobel was the first commanding captain of Easy Company, a man who came from a business background in Chicago and had volunteered to join the airborne forces. In the eyes of the men under his command, Sobel was never a model leader. He was a despised nightmare. Sobel ruled the company with extreme discipline bordering on psychological abuse, punishing soldiers for the most absurd reasons, issuing inconsistent and contradictory orders, and displaying an alarmingly poor ability in navigation and tactical map work. The soldiers whispered a bitter truth among themselves. If Sobel ever led them into battle, he would get them killed before the Germans even had a chance to fire. Yet, ironically, there was one thing Sobel did remarkably well, though it was certainly not his intention. Sobel turned the process of tormenting his men into a forge, hardening and tempering Easy Company to a degree no other unit at Toccoa could match. Under Sobel's brutal pressure, these young men shed their boyish naivety and became resilient, disciplined, and above all, bound together by an unbreakable bond of brotherhood. The kind of bond that can only form when people endure the darkest days of their lives together. Alongside the minds of command, the picture of Easy Company was filled in by other vivid pieces. There was Bill Guarneri, the hot-blooded Italian-American from Philadelphia with a reckless, almost insane courage on the battlefield. There was Joe Toye, Guarneri's neighbor from the same Philadelphia block, a quiet but fearless soldier, always the first to charge into danger. There was Don Malarkey, the gentle young man from Oregon with a warm smile and a sensitive soul. There was Eugene Rowe, the Cajun from Louisiana, a self-taught medic whose name would later become the sole spiritual anchor for the entire company during the suffocating winter at Bastogne. And there was Ronald Spears, a Scotsman raised in Boston, a cold and frighteningly ruthless man, surrounded by bloody legends that no one dared to confirm. They came from different backgrounds, carried entirely different personalities, and most of them had never known each other's names before putting on the olive green uniform of the U.S. Army. But from that fateful summer of 1942 onward, the wheel of fate bound them together on a shared journey, a brutal journey, far beyond anything they could have imagined when they first stood gazing at the shadow of that Georgia mountain. The mountain looming before them was named Curehe. In the language of the Cherokee, it means stands alone. And very soon, facing the trials ahead, they would deeply understand the 5 short English words that held within them an entire philosophy of survival. We stand alone together. That was Easy Company, and the film of their great journey is only now truly beginning.
Chapter 1: The Toccoa Crucible. If you took the question, "What forged Easy Company?" to any veteran of the company, the answer you'd get would certainly not be a famous campaign, not a brilliant general, and even less so any flowery speeches. They would name only one place: Toccoa. Bound to that name was a towering mountain, a despised and tyrannical commander, and 3 fateful words they would carry with them until their final breath. Camp Toccoa lay hidden among the remote hills of northern Georgia. It had been thrown up hastily, makeshift, like the hundreds of other wartime camps across America, with crude wooden and tin barracks, dust-choked drill fields, and the stifling, oppressive heat typical of the South. Nothing about the architecture here suggested the grandeur or glory of an army. And yet, rising directly behind the camp to a height of over 600 meters above sea level, stood Mount Curehe, the entity that would carve itself into the heart of every Easy Company soldier as the most terrifying obsession they would carry to their last days. In the ancient language of the Cherokee, Curehe carries a spiritual meaning: stand alone. No one knows exactly when the phrase first emerged or who coined it, but it quickly seeped into the bloodstream, becoming the spiritual backbone of the entire 506th Regiment. We stand alone together. The contradiction in that phrase can only be fully understood from a paratrooper's point of view. The moment you leap out the aircraft door into the dark night sky, in that first instant, you are completely alone amid the vast heavens. You stand alone. But deep inside, you know your comrades are also falling through that same dark void, and the moment you hit the ground, you will find each other and fight together. That is the true soul of the motto. Herbert Sobel, the man who laid the first foundations of Easy Company, may have been hopelessly inept at tactics, but there was one thing he understood better than anyone. To survive the brutality of war, a soldier must learn to break every limit of himself before he ever sets foot on the battlefield. And Sobel's training philosophy was utterly merciless. Push a man to the absolute breaking point of his endurance, then force him to take one more step. Every morning, while the world was still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness, Sobel's whistle would tear through the silence, signaling Easy Company to begin its run up to the summit of Curehe and back down. It was a grueling round trip of nearly 10 kilometers, draining every ounce of strength over steep, rocky, gravel-strewn slopes. In many stretches, there was no path at all. And this ordeal wasn't limited to once a day. Some days it was twice, 3 times. A single disapproving shake of Sobel's head at the company's performance meant they had to start all over again. There were even rainy nights that they were roused from their bunks to conquer Curehe in pitch darkness, where you couldn't even make out the face of the man beside you. Alongside the nightmare of the mountain runs, their daily schedule was an endless chain of field marches under crushing loads of equipment, crawling beneath razor-sharp barbed wire while live ammunition screamed overhead, attack and defense drills, and mastering every weapon from the infantry rifle to the heavy mortar. As if that weren't enough, Sobel took particular delight in springing surprise physical tests on the men at moments when they were already completely spent. Food was perpetually scarce, and sleep became a luxury. Years later, Don Malarkey still couldn't forget those nights curled up on the cold wooden floor at Toccoa, every muscle in his body aching so badly that even turning over felt impossible. In the darkness, he questioned his own decision to volunteer for the paratroopers, but when the wake-up whistle sounded the next morning, he still dragged himself up and ran out to the training field. They all did, not because they were machines incapable of feeling pain, but for one simple reason. No one wanted to be the first to collapse and quit in front of his brothers. And that was the priceless gift that Sobel, whether by accident or design, forged into this unit. A fierce collective pride, a shared sense of dignity among men who suffered together. It created an iron mindset. If the man beside you could still keep going, then you absolutely could not be the one to fall. Yet alongside the brutal training, Sobel also spread fear through something else entirely. His arbitrary, capricious, and deeply unjust way of managing people. Sobel had a special talent for hunting down and harshly punishing the most laughably trivial mistakes. A single button improperly fastened during inspection could be enough for him to send the entire platoon on an extra lap of curragh. A question he didn't like the sound of could instantly turn into days of disciplinary punishment. He routinely changed orders at the last minute, throwing exercises into pointless chaos. The peak of concern came during field tactical exercises, where Sobel repeatedly made decisions so seriously flawed that junior officers had to quietly, secretly correct them behind his back, since no one dared confront him directly. Winters understood this danger better than anyone. He watched in silence, memorizing every detail, burying his thoughts within. But between him and Sobel, from the very first days, there existed an unbridgeable rift. Sobel recognized the respect and admiration the men freely gave Winters, something no amount of authority could ever earn him. In response, Sobel repeatedly targeted Winters with baseless disciplinary actions, hoping to tear down his standing. Winters answered this persecution by quietly accepting every punishment without a word of complaint, without explanation or defense. But it was precisely this restraint and inner strength that made him an untouchable figure in the hearts of his fellow soldiers. The suffocating tension that had been building for so long finally erupted in the autumn of 1942, leading to an event without precedent in the history of the United States Army. In a coordinated act, the non-commissioned officers of Easy Company, the sergeants and staff sergeants who were closest to and understood best the feelings of the enlisted men, together signed a request for transfer out of the unit. This was not an act of cowardly desertion. They did it out of an iron conviction. If a tactically incompetent man like Sobel continued to lead Easy Company into battle, they and their brothers would die needlessly under enemy fire. This was a gamble with their very lives. Under the strict discipline of the wartime military, collective action against the orders of a superior fell under the charge of insubordination, even mutiny, a crime whose maximum penalty was execution by firing squad. The men who signed that fateful petition understood the price they might pay, and still they signed.
The shockwave forced higher command to intervene, but rather than dismiss Sobel outright, the Army chose a far more delicate solution. He was reassigned to a newly established parachute training center, a position that completely isolated him from any direct combat command at the front. In terms of technical parachute training skill, Sobel was, in truth, a capable man, and he served out the rest of the war in that capacity, behind the lines. As for the non-commissioned officers who had signed the petition, several were demoted and given formal reprimands. Winters himself stood entirely apart from this uprising, but his natural authority gradually saw him entrusted with greater responsibility, step by step filling the vacuum of leadership that Sobel left behind. This historic episode left behind a hard-won lesson that Easy Company would carry with them throughout their entire path through the war. A good leader doesn't need to be the most beloved, but he must absolutely be the most trusted. And once that trust erodes to nothing, the cliff face of authority will, sooner or later, collapse. While these pieces on the chessboard of officer politics and power were being rearranged at the top, the ordinary privates of Easy Company still had to focus on their own supreme life-or-death task, learning to throw themselves out of an airplane. To earn the honor of pinning the proud Parachute Wings badge to their chest, the certification of a true paratrooper, every trainee had to successfully complete 5 jumps from an aircraft, including at least 1 night jump and 1 jump while carrying the full weight of combat equipment. The requirements sounded simple enough on paper, but each moment standing at the open door of a roaring aircraft hundreds of meters in the air was a fierce inner battle, where reason had to override a survival instinct hardwired by millions of years of evolution. Not everyone could pass this mental trial. Some walked to the door, looked down into the void, and stepped back trembling. The army didn't call these men cowards. They simply didn't belong to the sky. For those with enough courage to make that first jump, they all shared one strange, common experience. It wasn't overwhelming fear, but rather a startling sense of peace, as the body realized it was floating free among the clouds and still alive. By the second and third jumps, that smothering feeling faded, replaced by confidence. And after the 5th jump, they officially became warriors of the sky. Bill Guinair later recalled his first night jump as one of the most surreal memories of his life. Plunging into the pitch-black void, the ground completely vanished, with no point of reference to tell how many meters he was from the earth. The only things that existed were the shriek of wind in his ears and the proud, thunderous crack of the parachute opening overhead. Then, the moment he landed, he looked up and saw hundreds of pure white parachute blossoms drifting silently down from the night sky. In that moment, Guinair understood that he and his comrades had become something entirely different, something far beyond the ordinary infantrymen down on the ground. As 1943 began, with the moment of truth drawing near, Easy Company, along with the entire 101st Division, received secret orders to ship out to England for the final phase of combat training ahead of the campaign to liberate Europe. They were packed tightly aboard transport ships crossing the Atlantic, crammed into cramped, stifling quarters, living in constant dread that German U-boats might strike at any moment. They stepped onto English docks carrying light personal baggage, but in their hearts they carried a heavy pack full of unanswered questions about the future. The company was billeted at Aldbourne, an ancient, peaceful village tucked away in Wiltshire in southern England. Life in Aldbourne moved to a different rhythm than the storm-racked days of Toccoa. Gone was the shadow of Mount Currahee chasing them every morning. Gone was Sobel's piercing whistle in the dead of night. In their place came lazy, late afternoons over pints in local pubs, easy conversations with the villagers, hurried letters sent home across the ocean, and the burst of joy when a reply finally arrived. This lull gave the soldiers time to reflect, but for a warrior awaiting the call to battle, thinking too much could be the most dangerous weapon of all against the mind. Still, the wheel of training never stopped, it only changed in nature. They no longer drilled the basics. Now they were thrown into specific tactical scenarios, simulating real battlefield situations. How to clear a heavily defended village, methods for neutralizing a fortified artillery position, or how to seize and hold a vital bridge while awaiting reinforcements. Every exercise carried with it a distinct sense of premonition that somewhere, at some headquarters, strategic minds already knew exactly what skills Easy Company would soon need for a battle of life and death that was fast approaching. Spring 1944 arrived. Across the fog-shrouded island, one could feel a thick, charged atmosphere, tight as a spring coiled before an enormous storm. Hundreds of thousands of troops from America, Britain, Canada, and the other Allied nations were massing there in force. News pouring in from the front showed German forces beginning to pull back into defensive positions on multiple fronts. But everyone understood that to truly end this brutal war, the Allies needed one decisive iron blow struck directly at the heart of the Nazi-occupied European continent. The men of Easy Company understood full well that a historic moment was fast approaching. The only thing they couldn't know was the exact time and place of that day of reckoning. And then, in the early days of June 1944, the final orders came down. They were issued full loads of ammunition, supplies, and combat rations. Young faces were smeared with charcoal and mud for camouflage. Heads were shaved on both sides, leaving only a defiant mohawk strip, a distinctive mark the paratroopers chose so they could recognize each other amid the smoke and fire. They sat down to write their final letters home, many of them writing with a quiet, bitter awareness that these might be the last words they would ever send back to the world of the living. In Aldburn, the night before June 5, 1944, passed in a stillness as quiet as any other night in that village. But inside the tents of Easy Company, the darkness was torn apart by sleepless thoughts. Winters sat silently beneath the dim glow of an oil lamp, turning the pages of his Bible. Nixon slowly poured himself another glass of whiskey, seeking some comfort. Guinair clenched his fists, his mind on his brother who had fallen on the Italian front, silently swearing he would make the enemy pay in blood. In another corner, Malarkey stared up at the ceiling, trying to picture what his beloved Oregon would look like at this time of year. Before the first rays of the new day could break, they climbed onto military trucks bound for the air plate. And then, in the dense darkness torn open by the deafening roar of hundreds of C-47 transport plane engines, Easy Company officially left England, closing the book of a year of waiting. The blood and fire-soaked land of Normandy awaited them ahead, and there, everything that the hell of Toccoa had forged within them, for better or worse, would be weighed on war's most merciless and precise scale. The reality of the battlefield.
Chapter 3. D-Day, the night they jumped into hell. On the night of June 5, 1944, a thick, moonless darkness blanketed by heavy cloud cover hung over the skies of southern England. Cutting through that murky expanse, a massive fleet of over 800 C-47 transport planes pressed relentlessly southeast through the wind. Inside each cramped fuselage sat 18 to 20 paratroopers, their hearts pounding in time with the engines, heading straight toward the French coastline, bristling with Nazi Germany's formidable defenses. This was the opening moment of Operation Overlord, known to history by its fateful name, D-Day, the greatest and most ambitious amphibious invasion in the history of human warfare. Within the next 24 hours, a massive wave of nearly 160,000 soldiers from America, Britain, Canada, and the Allied forces would simultaneously turn their weapons toward the beaches of Normandy. But before the first infantry boots could touch the sand at dawn, the airborne forces had to carry out a life-or-death mission: drop into the darkness, penetrate deep behind enemy lines, smash the defensive positions, and sever every route of German reinforcement. On the flat maps in the command tents of the generals, the plan looked clear and orderly, but the moment it met the reality of the battlefield, every calculation was thrown into a whirlwind of chaos.
Inside the steel frames of the C-47s, the air was thick, suffocating, and tense to the point of breathlessness. Each soldier carried on his back a massive load, averaging over 35 kilograms, rifles, ammunition, rations, main and reserve parachutes, mines, grenades, and dozens of other supplies meant to survive and fight for 48 hours without resupply. They sat pressed shoulder to shoulder along the 2 rows of metal seats, exchanging silent glances since the deafening roar of the engines outside swallowed any attempt at conversation. Winters sat motionless right by the door, his eyes closed, not to find sleep, but it was the only way he could hold on to his focus. Nixon was somewhere else in the sky, aboard another plane. Guarnier gripped his rifle stock tightly, his mind burning with thoughts of his brother who had fallen on the Italian front, fueled by a simmering hatred. In another corner, Malarkey stared through the small window into the black void outside, trying to picture what the land he was about to drop into would look like once his body plunged into the darkness. And then the nightmare began as every plan completely derailed. The moment the formation crossed into the airspace over the Carentan Peninsula in Normandy, the German early warning network detected them and unleashed its entire anti-aircraft system. The ground seemed to shake, and the night sky was suddenly torn apart by thousands of orange and red flashes, weaving together into a deadly curtain of fire. Several C-47s took direct hits, burst into flames, and plunged straight into the sea. The ones that survived were forced into sharp turns, sudden bursts of speed, and abrupt changes in altitude to dodge the flak, and this was what shattered the once orderly formation completely. When the green light inside the cabin flicked on, the deadly signal for the paratroopers to jump, most of the planes had drifted wildly off their intended drop zones. Under the pressure of the firestorm, pilots dropped their men at speeds, altitudes, and angles far outside the standard parameters. As a result, many soldiers leapt straight into the sea the moment they left the door, and were dragged down to the ocean floor by the sheer weight of their gear. Others landed in fields the Germans had deliberately flooded, a vicious trap laid in advance, and drowned on what was technically dry land. Those lucky enough to land safely found themselves stunned to realize they were utterly alone in unfamiliar territory, kilometers from their comrades, with nothing but hazy memories of a map to guide them.
In the first hours of D-Day, the entire American airborne force was thrown into near total disarray. Instead of companies and battalions moving in coordinated formation as they had rehearsed, the ground of Normandy was now scattered with fragments, small clusters of 2 or 3 men, even lone individuals groping through the darkness in search of others like themselves. To survive and identify one another in that blurred line between friend and foe without alerting the Germans, American paratroopers carried a crude little device called a clicker, a small piece of metal that made a clicking sound like a cicada. 1 click meant "who's there?" and 2 clicks in response meant "friendly." In the dangerous stillness of that Normandy night, that little clicking sound was the melody of survival. Veterans later recalled that the moment of hearing an unfamiliar sound, then nervously clicking back twice and seeing a friendly face emerge from the dark was one of the most overwhelming feelings of relief and joy of their entire lives. And yet, in the midst of all that chaos, the brave men of Easy Company began finding each other through something almost like instinct. Winters landed safely, but the force of his parachute opening had ripped his rifle away, leaving him with only a pistol and a combat knife. Without a flicker of panic, he set off through the darkness, clicking steadily, listening for every small sound, and gathering up lost soldiers along the way. By the time the first light of dawn broke, Winters had assembled a group of roughly 12 to 13 men, a patchwork remnant of Easy Company, including even a few stragglers from other units.
As pitifully small as that number was, it was all Winters had, and the battlefield waits for no one. A senior officer happened upon Winters and handed him an urgent life-or-death assignment. At a nearby estate called Brecourt Manor, the Germans had set up a fortified artillery position with 4 105mm guns dug into a trench system. That battery was raining fire down on Utah Beach, where tens of thousands of American infantrymen were landing and exposed to its guns. Every shell that fell meant dozens more American lives lost on the sand. Winters' mission was absolute: silence that battery at any cost. The reconnaissance report immediately doused his resolve in cold water. The position was guarded by roughly 50 heavily armed German soldiers. Winters turned to look at his men. He had exactly 13. What happened next at Brecourt Manor on that fateful morning of June 6, 1944, became the stuff of legend, a textbook example of small unit infantry tactics still taught at West Point to this day. The enemy held a 4-to-1 numerical advantage, occupied a strong defensive trench network, and controlled both the terrain and the firepower. By any conventional military logic, using 13 men to assault a position held by 50 was suicide. But Richard Winters never thought in conventional terms. With a sharp tactical eye, he studied the layout of the enemy trenches and spotted a critical weakness. The guns were connected by a line of communication trenches, and if he attacked along that line in the right sequence, his men could roll up each position one by one before the Germans could even tell where the main thrust was coming from. Winters immediately split his 13 men into small specialized teams. One team would keep up suppressive fire to pin the Germans down in their trenches. A second team would receive the bold order to close in and storm the trench, while a third covered both flanks. Every point of attack had full support of the others. Each time a gun was knocked out, they would seize documents, plant explosives to destroy it, and quickly pull back before the enemy could regroup, then push on to the next target. The brutal fight lasted nearly 2 breathless hours. When the last shot fell silent, all 4 enemy guns had been reduced to twisted scrap metal. More than 15 German soldiers lay dead, the rest captured or scattered in retreat. On Winters' side, 4 were wounded, 2 of them seriously. Winters himself took a piece of shrapnel in the leg, but flatly refused to leave his post. Best of all, not a single man under his command was lost. The 4 guns of death that had been raining terror down on Utah Beach had fallen completely silent. For this extraordinary feat, Winters was put forward for the Medal of Honor, the highest honor in the U.S. military. However, due to the rigid rules and bureaucratic red tape of the Army's administrative system at the time, he ultimately received the Distinguished Service Cross instead. Though still a tremendous honor, it never matched the true magnitude of what he had achieved. Decades later, whenever this injustice was brought up, the surviving veterans of Easy Company could only shake their heads, eyes heavy with quiet regret. At the same time, in other corners of Normandy, other tragic and heroic chapters of D-Day were being written into history. In the strategic town of Sainte-Mère-Église, one of the key objectives for the American Airborne, a large house caught fire at the exact moment dozens of paratroopers were descending. The fire's glow lit up their white parachutes against the night sky, turning them into perfect targets. German soldiers below simply pointed their weapons up and opened fire. Many paratroopers were killed before their feet ever touched the ground. Among those caught in that grim fate was a soldier named John Steele of the 505th Regiment. Though not part of Easy Company, his story became one of the most endearing symbols of D-Day. As he fell, Steele's parachute became tangled on the bell tower of the Sainte-Mère-Église church in Normandy. He hung there in mid-air, helpless, watching the bloody battle unfold beneath him with no way to escape. With no other option, Steele played dead to avoid German gunfire, hanging there for over 2 hours before a German soldier spotted him, cut him down, and took him prisoner. He later escaped and went on to fight again. In tribute to that harrowing memory, the town still hangs a dummy in American paratrooper uniform from that same spot on the church tower to this day. It was thanks to the courage, bravery, and the desperate fighting of paratroopers scattered in the chaos that night that Saint-Mère-d'Église proudly became the first town in all of France to be liberated from Nazi German rule in World War II. As the first light of June 6, 1944 pushed back the darkness, Easy Company faced a harsh reality. They had lost a large portion of their planned strength. Many of their brothers were still trapped or lost somewhere among the fields and villages of Normandy. Some would find their way back to the unit through sheer will, others never would. But the survivors, exhausted from hunger, fatigue, and surrounded by enemies on every side, had no time to stop and grieve. Ahead of them lay their next strategic objective, the city of Carentan, the vital link that had to be taken at all costs to connect Utah and Omaha beaches. Without that link, the entire Normandy beachhead risked being split apart, isolated, and broken piece by the Germans. New orders came down. Easy Company was to march immediately straight towards Carentan. But before stepping into that next fight, that morning, Winters and his men paused, looking out over Utah Beach from behind the dense hedgerows of the Normandy countryside. Before them stretched an overwhelming sight. Thousands of warships and landing craft packing the vast sea. The thunder of distant naval guns rolled in like rumbling storms, and somewhere on that blood-soaked stretch of sand, thousands of American infantrymen were pushing ashore, never knowing that the massive guns which had nearly taken their lives had been silenced completely, thanks to the courage of 13 men, led by a commander who won not by numbers, but with a cool head. The historic day of D-Day was not yet over. The road to liberate Europe still stretched long ahead, paved with hardship and blood. But Easy Company had shown the world they were no ordinary men. The Crucible of Toccoa had forged them, the trial of Normandy had tempered them, and still they stood, together.
Chapter 4. Carentan, Market Garden, and Holland. After the triumph at Brecourt Manor, one might have expected the storm ahead to ease somewhat, but the battlefield never operates by such gentle logic. For the warriors of Easy Company, every dawn that broke opened a new chapter of blood, sweat, and mud. The next name waiting on their road of life and death was Carentan, a small anonymous town before the summer of 1944, but one about to carve its name into the history books as one of the most brutal urban battlegrounds the American airborne would ever face in the entire war. Carentan's strategic importance lay in its unique location. The town sat directly between the Utah and Omaha beachheads. As long as German guns held Carentan, the two main American forces remained cut off from each other, unable to join into a single front. Isolated like that, each American pocket on the beaches would become easy prey, picked apart and destroyed piece by the Nazis. Recognizing this imminent danger, Allied headquarters issued a supreme order. The resistance at Carentan had to be uprooted at any cost. On June 10, 1944, Easy Company's spearheads, along with the entire 506th Regiment, began quietly closing in on the objective. The single road leading into town narrowed across a small bridge, flanked on either side by overgrown lanes lined with thick hedgerows. The terrain French call bocage. It was a patchwork of small fields separated by raised earthen banks and dense thorny brush. This was paradise for the defenders and hell on earth for any attacking force. Every unremarkable mound of earth could be hiding a cold-blooded sniper. Every blind corner could be a deadly trap concealing a machine gun nest. The moment Easy Company's first steps touched the edge of the road leading into Carentan, the roar of German machine guns from the positions ahead tore through the air. The lead soldier was hit and fell. The next man up went down just as fast. The entire column froze in an instant, every man dropping flat onto the dusty road. There was nowhere to hide.
The embankments on either side of the road were too low and too thin. Crossfire screamed past, inches from their faces, like a metal storm. It was in that suffocating moment that men bitterly realized how completely different real war was from anything taught in training exercises. At the Toccoa drill field, when the whistle blew to end the exercise, you could brush off the dust, stand up, and stroll off to dinner. Here, standing up at the wrong moment meant you would remain in that earth forever. In that frozen instant where everything seemed to stop from sheer terror, the thin line between life and death came down to one supreme ability, forcing the mind to overcome the body's fear and keep moving, even on legs that trembled and refused to hold. In the storm of bullets, Winters gave the order to advance. There was no frantic shouting, no dramatic arm waving like in the movies. He simply gave a short order, his voice calm but unyielding, just loud enough to reach the men's ears. Move forward. And as if by some miracle, one by one, they began to move. They crawled, rolled, ran hunched over, darting from one depression in the earth to the next stone ridge. Every yard gained forward was another bet against death itself. Through sheer will, they finally broke through the outer defenses and began pushing into the town center. But the streets of Carentan offered no relief from the open fields. The Germans had laid an elaborate web, machine guns carefully positioned at blind corners, snipers lying in wait behind upper-floor windows, and booby traps buried right beneath doorsteps. To take the town, they had to clear it house by house, room by room. It was a slow, breathlessly tense process, paid in a great deal of blood. In the eye of that brutal storm at Carentan, a small but haunting story unfolded, tied to the fate of a soldier named Albert Blythe. Blythe was a young man from Illinois, gentle and quiet, someone who had been almost invisible during all the months of training back home. But since that horrifying night of D-Day, something invisible inside him had shattered. Suddenly, Blythe could no longer see anything at all. His eyes went dark, even though the army doctors examined him thoroughly and found no physical injury whatsoever. Blythe had been blinded by psychological trauma, a condition the medicine of that era called shell shock or combat exhaustion, and the world today knows as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Winters came and sat quietly beside Blythe to talk with his soldier. No criticism, no judgment in his eyes, and no hollow phrases like "be a man and toughen up." He simply listened in silence and gently asked Blythe what he feared most. Blythe, trembling, admitted that he was afraid of dying. Winters looked at him directly and said something harsh. Once Blythe accepted that he had, in a sense, already been dead from the moment he stepped into this war, he would no longer have anything left to fear. It was a brutal truth, hard to swallow, but for Blythe's fragile state of mind, it acted like a powerful medicine. His sight miraculously returned. He got up, picked up his rifle, and rejoined the fight. The memory of Albert Blythe stands as living proof that war doesn't only wound the body with shrapnel. The invisible wounds bleeding inside a person's mind can sometimes be far more painful and far more lasting. But one thing never changed at Easy Company. No one had to carry those hidden wounds alone as long as the men around him still had a hand to offer.
After extraordinary effort, Carentan was finally and fully liberated on June 12, 1944. The objective of linking Utah and Omaha beaches was achieved. The Normandy beachhead was now secured beyond doubt. Easy Company had once again carried out its mission brilliantly, but the price of that glory was the absence of familiar faces at roll call and new names continually added to the growing list of casualties with each bloody day. With the Normandy campaign closed, Easy Company was ordered back to England to recover and rebuild their ranks. They returned to Aldbourne, the small, peaceful village in Wiltshire where they had once trained before D-Day. But the atmosphere in Aldbourne now carried the weight of mourning. The places once held by fallen veterans now stood as gaping holes. To fill out the ranks, fresh replacements arrived, young men who had never smelled gunpowder and had no idea of the true brutality of war. The veterans looked at these newcomers with a mixture of sympathy and a kind of distance, the look of men who had walked back from the edge of death and seen things that no words on earth could ever describe. The summer of 1944 slowly passed. The Allies continued their unstoppable advance across Normandy, proudly liberating Paris in August. The tide of the war seemed to be turning decisively. In the camps, an optimistic whisper began to spread that maybe, just maybe, by Christmas, this war would finally be over and everyone would go home. But when September 1944 arrived, a bold military plan, codenamed Operation Martin Garden, emerged, shattering every illusion of an easy victory. The architect of Martin Garden was none other than Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a British general famous worldwide for his extreme caution, who this time decided to launch one of the boldest and most reckless military gambles of the entire Second World War. Montgomery's core idea was to drop an unprecedented mass of airborne troops into the Netherlands, rapidly seizing a chain of strategic bridges spanning the rivers and canals stretching from Eindhoven in the south up to Arnhem in the north. The goal was to create a safe corridor over 100 kilometers long, driving straight into enemy territory. Right behind it, a massive armored force on the ground would race up this corridor, cross the Rhine at the crucial point of Arnhem, and pour into the plains of northern Germany. If everything went smoothly, the Nazi war machine would be strangled and the guns would fall silent by Christmas 1944. It was a perfect, flawless scenario, on paper, in the hands of the planners, but it rested on a chain of overly optimistic assumptions with virtually no contingency plans for the things that could and would go wrong. On September 17, 1944, Easy Company, along with the entire 101st Division, leapt out of their planes, opening the largest daylight airborne assault in human history over the Netherlands. This experience was the complete opposite of the pitch-black night over Normandy. The sky above was clear and open wide. They could easily see the ground stretching below, see their comrades' parachutes filling the air, and see the villages and fields of the land of tulips laid out in vivid detail. As the white blossoms of parachutes drifted down from the sky, Dutch civilians poured out of their homes in joy, waving and throwing bright bouquets of flowers into the air. After 4 long years under the boot of Nazi occupation, they believed that true freedom had finally arrived. The 101st Division's task was to seize and hold the chain of bridges stretching from Eindhoven to Veghel, securing the southern segment of the strategic corridor. The early days of the operation went largely as planned. Eindhoven was liberated amid overwhelming joy. The Dutch poured into the streets with radiant smiles, bringing out bottles of orange-colored liquor they had hidden away for years. Easy Company marched proudly through the old cobblestone streets to the roaring cheers of the crowd, a feeling of happiness so strange and surreal after everything they had endured in Normandy. But further north, at Arnhem, where Britain's 1st Airborne Division had been tasked with seizing the most critical bridge of all, a horrifying disaster was quietly unfolding. Allied intelligence made a fatal error, overlooking a critically important piece of information. 2 of Germany's elite panzer divisions were resting and refitting right next to the British landing zones. The moment the British paratroopers hit the ground, they found themselves facing heavy tanks head-on, weapons of destruction against which lightly equipped paratroopers stood almost no chance. The British forces were quickly surrounded at Arnhem and ground down hour by hour.
The bridge at Arnhem, the final link and the very soul of Operation Martin Garden, was never held long enough for the ground armor to break through. The grand gamble collapsed completely. The dream of ending the war by Christmas evaporated into thin air. While disaster strangled Arnhem in the north, Easy Company faced its own life-and-death struggle along a route the soldiers began calling, with grim irony, Hell's Highway. The name Hell's Highway was the blood-soaked nickname American soldiers gave to Highway 69, the single road running the length of the Martin Garden corridor from south to north. It was the sole artery of supply and movement for the entire operation, and German command understood exactly how vital it was. They launched relentless, ferocious raids into both flanks of the road, severing the strategic corridor at multiple key points and forcing the Allies to throw everything into bloody counterattacks just to reopen it.
Easy Company was given responsibility for defending a critical stretch of Hell's Highway near Wegel. This was the kind of mission every soldier dreaded most. They couldn't advance, but they also weren't defending a fixed line. They had to stretch themselves to protect a lifeline under constant threat from every direction, with no idea when or from where the enemy might strike next. On September 22nd, the Germans massed a large force of tanks and infantry, smashed through a checkpoint, and successfully cut Hell's Highway, completely isolating the Allied forces to the north. Easy Company and neighboring units were forced into a brutal close-quarters counterattack just to retake control of the road. But almost as soon as the gunfire died down, they had to scramble back into defensive positions, then another enemy assault would come. This grueling cycle of attack and exhaustion repeated itself week after week. But even in the darkest days on the island, Richard Winters still found a moment to prove what made him an exceptional commander. On one night in late October 1944, under the cover of darkness, he personally led a small team across the Rhine. They struck a German outpost on the far bank in a surprise raid, wiping out the enemy squad on the spot and seizing a trove of invaluable intelligence documents before withdrawing safely without a single casualty among their own. It was a bold move, entirely outside any plan handed down from above, born purely from the instincts of a commander who knew exactly when to act and acted decisively. The gloomy Dutch autumn passed quietly on. The list of Easy Company's fallen grew longer still. The new replacements gradually learned to fall into step with the hardened rhythm of the veterans. Winters' outstanding leadership earned him a promotion, moving him up to battalion command. It was a reward he had fully earned through his actions, but it carried a bitter edge as well. He would no longer stand shoulder to shoulder in the same foxhole, sharing every hardship with the men he had guided since those grueling early days at Toccoa. The Army lifts you up when you do your job well, and sometimes that is exactly how war cruelly takes the finest leaders away from the men they need most. In November 1944, new marching orders came down, and Easy Company was officially pulled out of the Netherlands. They'd held that ground for over 70 days, far longer than any planner had anticipated. On a gray morning, they climbed wearily onto military trucks, looking back one last time at the flat fields of the land of tulips, certain they were finally heading to the rear for a real rest. Their destination was Marmolon-le-Grand, a military base in eastern France. There, for the first time in months, they slept on soft mattresses, ate hot meals, and were no longer jolted awake by the roar of artillery in the night. The taut nerves of Easy Company's men slowly began to loosen. Some, lucky enough to get leave, eagerly caught rides to glamorous Paris to unwind. Back at camp, laughter and joking returned. Men slept in later and started grumbling again about the quality of the mess hall cooks.
The kind of carefree, meaningless complaints that only surface in people who no longer have to live with the constant weight of life and death. But these weary soldiers had no idea that to the east, deep within the dark, dense forests of the Ardennes, German command was secretly massing a massive force, tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of tanks for a colossal counteroffensive, a death blow that no one in the entire Allied command suspected was coming. And when that thunderbolt struck, Easy Company would be thrown straight into the heart of hell, without even a moment to grab a warm coat. The battlefield of Bastogne was waiting for them ahead, cold and merciless, and there awaited the harshest, most brutal trial of their entire lives.
Chapter 5. Bastogne, the White Hell. At the gray edge of dawn on December 17, 1944, the men of Easy Company were still deep in sleep at Camp Mourmelon-le-Grand in France. These were rare and precious hours of peace after more than 70 days of grinding endurance on the narrow strip of land called the Island in the Netherlands. Inside the barracks, some were excitedly laying plans for an upcoming pass to glamorous Paris. Others were bent over hasty letters home. They were living the simplest, most ordinary habits of soldiers that the wheel of war had temporarily released from its grip. Then the assembly whistle screamed without warning, tearing the calm from the air. The urgent intelligence that came flooding back sent a shockwave through the entire American military. Deep in the dark forests of the Ardennes along the Belgian and Luxembourg border, German command had just secretly unleashed a massive counteroffensive, a thunderbolt that no Allied strategist could have anticipated. More than 200,000 German troops, backed by hundreds of heavy armored tanks, struck head-on against the thinnest, most vulnerable point of the American line. This lethal blow shattered Allied formations, carving a vast and dangerous indentation into the military map that history would later call the Battle of the Bulge. In a matter of moments, tens of thousands of American soldiers were encircled, destroyed, or taken prisoner, and the entire balance of the European theater shifted with dizzying speed. Amid that swirling storm of chaos, every eye turned to a small town called Bastogne, a strategic point sitting at the very heart of the Ardennes. It was the crossroads of 8 vital roads in the region. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the entire battlefield. The Germans were desperate to swallow it at any cost, while the Allies knew it absolutely could not be lost. The urgent order came down. The 101st Airborne Division was to march immediately, straight into Bastogne. The order was issued in the late afternoon, and by the time darkness fell, the men of Easy Company were already scrambling onto the backs of trucks. Everything moved so fast that the division's logistics system was completely paralyzed and unable to keep pace. When the men climbed aboard, most had no proper winter coat to their name. Ammunition was critically short. Many units went to war without gloves, wool caps, or cold weather boots, the kind of gear that meant life or death once the brutal winter December of the Ardennes had arrived. They set out surrounded by shortages, with no clear picture of their destination and no idea what awaited them ahead. The only thing any of them knew was that the situation was desperately, urgently dire. The march to Bastogne stretched over 160 kilometers. Through the long night, open-topped military trucks raced through the howling, bone-cutting cold of the Belgian winter. Temperatures plunged below freezing. The soldiers huddled together on the bare truck beds, pressing shoulders against each other for what little warmth they could share. A frightening silence hung over them all. Along the road, they encountered streams of men and vehicles moving in the opposite direction, shattered American infantry units retreating in disarray after being torn apart by the Germans, their faces drained white, eyes blank and hollow, the look of men who had just crawled out of hell.
Through the cold wind, they shouted at the trucks of the 101st pressing forward, "You're going the wrong way! The enemy is that direction! Turn back!" But in answer to those frantic warnings, the men on the trucks only looked back at them in silence, said nothing, and drove straight on into the storm. Bastogne reached the perimeter of Bastogne on December 19th and was immediately thrown into the line to establish a defensive ring around the town. The stretch of the line they were assigned lay deep in the Bois-Jacques pine forest northeast of Bastogne. Bois-Jacques was a dense, gloomy stretch of pine that blocked out all sunlight even in summer, and when December closed in, it became a place of oppressive darkness and cold that seemed to press down on everything within it. Snow covered the ground deep underfoot. On the cruelest winter nights, temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Celsius, and the wretched men of Easy Company had to face that bone-deep cold without single piece of adequate cold weather gear. The first order upon taking position was to dig foxholes, but the ground had frozen solid, as hard and unyielding as concrete. Pickaxes and shovels struck down and simply bounced back with a harsh, ringing sound. To break the earth, they had to first use explosives to crack the frozen surface, then dig by hand. Each foxhole completed was a small triumph paid in hours of brutal labor in the flesh-cutting cold. But they understood, if they didn't dig, those holes would be their graves when the artillery came. And the German artillery came constantly. The Germans had completely encircled Bastogne from every direction. With an overwhelming advantage in manpower and heavy guns, they poured thousands of shells into the Bois-Jacques every day. These barrages arrived without warning, following no pattern or tactical logic that the Americans could anticipate. Crueler still, the German shells were fused to detonate in the air, exploding in the crowns of the tall pines and driving thousands of razor-sharp fragments straight down onto the men below at a nearly vertical angle. It was a nightmare because no ordinary foxhole or trench could protect against shrapnel falling from directly overhead. A soldier could press himself into the deepest hole he could dig, and death could still reach him. There was no way to predict when the next barrage would fall. Nowhere in that forest was truly safe. All a soldier could do was lie flat at the bottom of his hole, pray to whatever he believed in, and the moment the guns fell quiet, crawl back up to carry out his patrol, his watch, and push back the German infantry probing at the forest's edge. In that razor's edge of life and death, Eugene Rowe, Easy Company's medic, lived those days at Bastogne like a shuttle that never stopped running. Every time artillery shrieked overhead and everyone else was fighting to bury themselves deeper into the earth, Rowe had to run outward, sprinting towards wherever a cry of medic had just risen. His medical bag grew lighter with each passing hour as supplies were completely cut off. At his worst moments, he tore strips from any cloth or clothing he could find to staunch the bleeding of his brothers. Rowe carved his name in the hearts of the men at Bastogne, not through acts of killing, but through the image of a man who ran alone towards the guns and the screaming when everyone else was trying to flee from them.
The trial at Bastogne was not only a life-and-death gun battle against the Germans, it was a ruthless war of survival against the limits of the human body itself. Sleep deprivation accumulated day after day, grinding their strength down to nothing. Rations were cut to bare minimum as the enemy's iron encirclement blocked every supply flight. The cold seeped relentlessly through thin layers of clothing, working its way into muscle and bone with each passing hour. When a body is exposed to extreme cold for long enough, it begins to respond with excruciating pain. Frostbite became a terrifying epidemic. Many soldiers lost all feeling in their feet, leaving them unable to walk. With no suitable field boots, no dry socks to change into, and no fires permitted, even a few hours sitting motionless at the bottom of a foxhole was enough to cost a man feeling in his feet permanently. The soldiers passed along a bitter piece of hard-earned wisdom among themselves. If you wake up one morning and the pain in your feet is gone, that is precisely when you should be afraid. Pain meant the tissue was still alive. No pain meant that part of you had already died. More terrifying than any of this was something invisible, something formless but always present, a sensation that compressed the mind of every man there, the thin, blurred line between living and dying. Artillery shells have no eyes. There is no justice or moral law that determines whether a shell falls into this foxhole rather than the one beside it, or takes this soldier's life rather than that one. Any man who let his mind dwell on that thought would drive himself to madness. So those who kept their sanity had to find some way to push that fear out of their heads entirely, an inner battle every bit as grueling and exhausting as driving a pickaxe into frozen ground. And then January 13th, 1945 arrived, marking one of the darkest, most heartbreaking pages of Easy Company's history at Bastogne. Joe Toye and Bill Guarnier were inseparable brothers-in-arms who had grown up on the same working-class block in Philadelphia and had walked together through every high and low since the earliest days of training at Toccoa. Toye was quiet and hard as stone, a walking block of steel who had never shown fear before any danger. Guarnier was a flame, hot, volatile, always the first to volunteer to go where the fire was thickest. Two opposite natures that had blended and balanced each other into a great friendship, the kind of bond that can only be forged on the edge of life and death. During a fierce enemy bombardment, a shell fragment struck Joe Toye, dropping him onto the snow. Seeing his brother fall, Guarnier threw every rule of self-preservation from his mind. Without a moment's hesitation, he hurled himself out of his foxhole into the middle of a barrage, still raking the ground, and dragged Toye toward cover. It was the kind of insane decision that no rational person would make with shells still exploding all around them. But in that moment, Guarnier had no room inside him for his own fear. His mind held exactly one thought: he had to get his friend out. Then a second shell came down and detonated right beside them. When the merciless black smoke cleared, both men lay motionless on the snow, which had turned red around them. Each had been hit. Each had lost a leg. Toye lost his right leg, and Guarnier left his right leg behind in that forest forever. They lay only a few steps apart, looking up at the gray, bleak sky over Bastogne, while other soldiers frantically rushed forward to bind their wounds and drag them out of the enemy's sights. Years later, recalling that agonizing memory, Guarnier said what was seared into his heart was not the physical pain that tore through him, but the look in Toye's eyes when the two of them looked at each other in that moment. They had no need to speak, and couldn't have anyway. Their friendship had run too long and too deep to require any words for a moment like that. Both men were immediately evacuated to the rear for emergency surgery, closing forever their journey in the ranks of Easy Company. But they survived. In the hell of Bastogne, simply keeping your life was already a miracle far too great to put into words, something every man there silently thanked fate for. While those bloody tragedies were unfolding at the front, in another place not far away, a different page of history was being written inside the command bunker in the center of Bastogne. Confident in their overwhelming advantage of manpower and firepower, with the encirclement tightened like a noose, German command sent a delegation under a white flag to meet General Anthony McCullough, the officer commanding the isolated American forces inside the town. They presented him with an ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender to avoid a total annihilation. The document was composed in courteous, measured language that made it sound almost reasonable, laying out the hopeless position of the American forces in clear terms and offering an arrangement to evacuate civilians before the Germans eliminated all remaining resistance. McAuliffe read through the letter in silence, sat in thought for a moment, then picked up his pen and wrote his reply to the other side. The entirety of the American general's response was exactly one word: nuts. In American slang, the word carries a meaning of deep contempt and dismissal, roughly equivalent to nonsense or no chance. When they received the slip of paper, the German officer envoys were completely baffled and had to turn to the American officer accompanying them to ask whether this was an affirmative or a negative response. The American officer looked them squarely in the eye and explained with iron clarity, "It means go to hell. It is a decidedly negative reply." That singular, unforgettable reply passed instantly into history, becoming one of the most iconic symbols of the Allied forces' unbreakable will in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances in the European theater. But for the miserable soldiers huddled in frozen foxholes out in the Bois de Jacques, their ammunition nearly gone, no warm clothing, and tomorrow still a great unknown, the general's defiant answer was both a powerful source of inspiration and the cold confirmation that they would have to keep enduring the hell ahead one more day and then another. Yet the most memorable episode at Bastogne was not McAuliffe's famous word. It lay in what happened in a ferocious battle at the end of January 1945, when Easy Company received orders to assault and capture the village of Foy, a small settlement sitting right at the edge of the Bois de Jacques.
The man commanding Easy Company at that moment was an officer named Norman Dyke. He had been assigned to the unit from above through administrative channels, with no track record forged in real combat. Dyke was not a bad man, but he was absolutely not Richard Winters. And during the assault on Foy, that fatal weakness exposed itself in a way that was clear and dangerous beyond anything seen before. At the most brutal point of the battle, as Easy Company was pressing forward toward the village under ferocious German fire, Dyke suddenly panicked and ordered the entire formation to halt, in the middle of an open, snow-covered field with not a scrap of cover anywhere. He stood frozen there, issuing no order to advance and giving no order to withdraw, leaving his soldiers standing exposed in the open as human targets for the enemy's guns. With every second that passed in that paralysis, more American soldiers fell needlessly. From an observation post to the rear, Winters watched the whole terrible scene unfolding and understood that without immediate intervention, Easy Company would be cut to pieces right there on that snow field. Without a moment's hesitation, he turned and called for Ronald Spears, a captain commanding a different company, and shouted his order. Spears was to get out there immediately, relieve Dyke of command, and save the company. Spears immediately sprinted out across the open field raked by fire, took command on the spot, and then performed an act of such reckless audacity that it became the most legendary story in Easy Company's history. Rather than stop to reorganize and consolidate the formation by the book, Spears ran alone straight into the center of Foy, territory completely controlled by the Germans. He ran through enemy fire from one end of the village to the other to reach a cut-off pocket of American soldiers on the far side, relay the orders for coordinated action, and then turned around and ran back through the middle of the enemy's position a second time. To this day, no military analyst has been able to offer a rational explanation for why Spears was not hit by a single bullet on that suicidal round trip. Spears himself, in later years when it was brought up, would only keep silent. But the moment he came back and bellowed out the order to attack was like a shot of adrenaline straight into Easy Company's veins.
They rose as one, surged forward with a roar, and finally crushed the resistance, taking the village of Foy entirely. On December 26, 1944, the sound of distant guns from the south began rolling closer with each passing hour. And then, at the edge of the Bastogne perimeter, the massive silhouettes of the first tanks appeared. They were not the German armored behemoths. They were the tanks of General George Patton's legendary Third Army. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The town was relieved. For the soldiers who had spent over a month grinding through frozen misery in that forest, running short of ammunition, food, and hope, the roar of Patton's tank engines was the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard in their lives. Tears ran down faces that were gaunt and cracked raw from the cold. Some soldiers stood silently in their foxholes and watched the tanks roll past, unable to find a single word. Some bent their heads and wept openly. Others simply sat down, closed their eyes, and held the moment of stillness in absolute silence. But the wheel of war did not stop at that moment of triumph. The relief of Bastogne did not mean the town was free of the enemy. The Germans launched furious retaliatory counterattacks that ground on for weeks afterwards. Easy Company were still in their foxholes, blood was still being spilled, and men were still falling. Still those long, bone-cutting nights in the Bois Jacques, and still those mornings when the first task was the heartbreaking one, counting how many brothers remained. It was not until the first days of February 1945 that Easy Company finally received the official order to leave the Bastogne battlefield. When they climbed onto the trucks to move to the next front, not a single man looked back at the snow-covered pine forest behind them. Not because they wanted to deny it or erase it from memory, but because they understood that there are places of such darkness that once you have gone through them and walked out the other side, you no longer need your eyes to look back, because the shape of those places has already driven itself deep inside you and will walk with you for the rest of your life. The name Bastogne was never a story easily brought out and shared over drinks or a quiet evening. It was a mass of trauma, a heavy secret that each veteran chose to bury deep within himself, quietly and without a word, in the same way that thick snow pressed down on the pine boughs of the Bois Jacques that winter, a layer of permanent ice that could never fully melt away, even long after the brutal cold had receded far into the past.
Chapter 6. Into Germany. In February 1945, the trucks carrying Easy Company rolled slowly away from Bastogne and back to Camp Mourmelon-le-Grand on French soil, the very place they had departed from before the storm of snow and fire in the Ardennes came crashing down. But this time, the camp no longer carried the feeling of a temporary way station. For the paratroopers who had just walked back from the edge of death, it felt like a quiet space where they could learn to breathe again after being held under the current of a survival war for far too long. Stepping down from the trucks of Easy Company's warriors had changed completely from those of the previous December. The difference wasn't in the visible wounds, though many bodies now bore the permanent marks of shrapnel. It lived in something far deeper inside. It was the way they sat down in silence, eyes fixed on a point in empty space without a word. The way they no longer asked about the comrades who would never come back. Bastogne had quietly taken something from each man's soul, and not one of them could name exactly what was missing. Not until many years later, when white-haired men sat together again and tried, with great difficulty, to put words to something that resisted all language. But the merciless wheel of war never concerned itself with the wounds of the human heart. It only demanded, coldly, what needed to be done next. The brutal winter of 1945 eventually gave way to the first rays of spring. Across the European fronts, the tide of war had shifted in a direction that could no longer be reversed. Nazi Germany had suffered a devastating and irreversible defeat in its desperate Ardennes counteroffensive, losing its finest armored divisions with no resources left to rebuild them. To the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing like a tidal wave, pressing toward Berlin. To the west, the Allied forces were marshaling for the decisive and final chapter of the war. Crossing the Rhine, the great river running along Germany's western border, the last natural barrier standing between Allied guns and the heart of the Nazi Reich. For Easy Company and the 101st Division, orders to prepare for Operation Varsity came down in early March 1945. This was designated as the division's final airborne operation of the entire war and one of the largest single-day mass airborne assaults in military history. Over 16,000 American and British paratroopers would be dropped east of the Rhine in a single day. When the orders arrived, the veterans of Easy Company reacted with the kind of composure only men who had survived Normandy and the Netherlands could manage. They calmly checked their gear, quietly packed their equipment, and said very little. Gone was the pounding heartbeat of the night before D-Day. Gone, too, was the strange exhilaration of looking out over the sunlit Dutch countryside. Now it was simply a job, a mission that had to be completed so they could go home. On March 24, 1945, Easy Company officially crossed the Rhine. However, contrary to the heroic imagery one might picture, Easy Company did not set foot on German soil by leaping from a plane during Operation Varsity that day. The honor of the great jump that day belonged to other attached units, the American 117th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division. Easy Company, along with the rest of the 101st Division, crossed the Rhine by assault boat and improvised pontoon bridges after the lead elements had secured a bridgehead and then pushed deeper into Germany overland as motorized infantry. The moment their boots first touched German soil was an experience that many Easy Company soldiers later described in different words, but all of them landed on the same feeling, a strangeness that stopped them cold. After nearly 3 years from leaving America, after the fire of Normandy, the fields of the Netherlands, and the frozen hell of Bastogne, they were finally standing on enemy ground. This was not the territory of an occupied nation waiting to be liberated. This was the homeland of the very people who had ignited the entire human catastrophe. And yet, the Germany they saw with their own eyes looked nothing like any of them had imagined. There were no masses of fanatical citizens lining the streets and screaming loyalty to the Nazi regime, as Goebbels' propaganda films had always shown. Instead, there were shattered villages sunk in a deathly silence, windows shuttered and bolted tight, and the terrified eyes of old people and children peering out of narrow gaps in doorways. The roads were choked with streams of German refugees fleeing westward in desperation to escape the Red Army's advance from the east. The 1,000-year Reich was collapsing like a sandcastle, and its ordinary people were watching that destruction from within, with the helpless terror of those who had never truly had a choice about their fate. The first weeks on German soil passed at a rhythm entirely unlike anything in all the brutal phases of the war before. Germany's defensive system was breaking apart into pieces. The collapse was uneven. Scattered pockets of stubborn resistance still flared up into bloody firefights, but the atmosphere hanging over the whole front was that of a war machine tearing itself apart from within. Entire German units walked forward with their hands up the moment they caught sight of the first American patrols. Many senior officers abandoned their posts in a rush. Soldiers by the hundreds dropped their weapons along the roadside and stripped off their blood-stained uniforms. Easy Company pressed on east and south through the plains of central Germany, sweeping through towns and villages that no names that most of these young Americans had ever heard in their lives. The daily work was to take a town, root out whatever final resistance remained, restore order, and immediately move on. The march was not without its dangers. Occasional shots from die-hard holdouts still rang out, and those small, forgotten firefights still took lives right in the final days of the war. And that was the cruelest thing of all in its own particular way. To fall in the last days with the final victory already visible just ahead. And then the day came. A moment that no one in Easy Company would ever be able to forget, even though no one ever truly wanted to remember it. In late April 1945, as Easy Company was marching through Bavaria in southern Germany, they came upon a place called Kaufering 4. It was one of the satellite camps belonging to the notorious Dachau concentration camp system, the first camp the Nazis built in 1933, the one that served as the blueprint and the model for the entire network of death camps that followed. Kaufering 4 was not the main center of Dachau, but what appeared before the men of Easy Company there was a truth so horrifying that it needed no scale or explanation for any human being to grasp the absolute depths of depravity it represented. The soldiers walked through the camp gate into a silence that made the skin crawl. Bodies lay everywhere, too many bodies. They were scattered in every direction, inside rotting wooden barracks, exposed on the frozen ground, and tangled against the sharp barbed wire fences. The survivors who still drew breath had been reduced to barely human forms, living skeletons wrapped in skin, eyes sunken deep into their skulls, dressed in filthy, tattered prisoner uniforms of gray stripes. They looked up at the American soldiers who had just arrived with a gaze that no ordinary language could capture. It was not simple joy or pure gratitude, but the vacant, disbelieving look of people who had been locked away so long in darkness, stripped so completely of their humanity that they could not bring themselves to believe the freedom before their eyes was real. The hardened warriors of Easy Company, the men who had come through the fire of Normandy, watched their brothers torn apart at Bastogne and survived what seemed unsurvivable, now stood motionless in the heart of Kaufering 4, completely helpless, not knowing what to do beyond standing where they were. Webster, an Easy Company soldier who had studied at Harvard before enlisting and always kept the habit of writing everything down, managed to set to paper in his journal through tears that this was the first time in the entire war that he understood, not as a scholar's mind, but with a raw pain deep in his gut, the reason why they had to be here. All those months of brutal training at Toccoa, all the blood spilled at Normandy, all those sleepless winter nights at Bastogne, and all the deaths of their brothers, every sacrifice found its fullest and most devastating answer within the bleak confines of Kaufering 4. The SS guards who had run the camp had fled at a dead run before Easy Company arrived. They had tried to set fire to several barracks to destroy the evidence of their crimes, but the time pressure left them unable to erase everything. What remained was more than enough to ensure that no one in the world could ever claim they had not known. Easy Company did everything within their power and authority in those moments. They handed over their meager rations, urgently called for medical support, restored order, and ensured the surviving prisoners received immediate care. But through it all, not a word passed between them. Not because they were numb, but because language, the only tool human beings have for describing the world, was suddenly too small and too powerless to stand against what they were witnessing. Leaving the haunting shadow of Kaufering 4 behind, Easy Company marched south, deeper into the Bavarian Alps. This was one of the most beautiful landscapes in Germany. Vast, lush pine forests rolling over endless peaceful valleys and mountain peaks capped in white snow year-round.
The cruel contrast between the magnificent beauty of the natural world around them and the images of hell they had just witnessed at Kaufering 4 left a deep, unresolved ache that many veterans would return to again and again in the post-war years. How could the most grotesque and monstrous things in all of human history have taken place in one of the most beautiful and serene corners of Europe? The next destination in their sights was Berchtesgaden, a small town nestled in the Bavarian mountains on the Austrian border. This had been the location of Hitler's private mountain retreat and the lavish vacation residences of countless senior Nazi officials. By this point, Berchtesgaden was no longer a purely military objective in the textbook sense. German forces there had completely lost their ability to mount any organized resistance. It was a target of supreme symbolic importance, seizing the very last stronghold of the men who had brought ruin to the world. Easy Company moved into Berchtesgaden in the early days of May 1945. They wound through narrow mountain passes, crossed bridges left intact because the Germans no longer had the time or will to mine them, and passed through Bavarian villages where white flags of surrender already hung from the windows. Occasionally, the stillness was torn by a few isolated shots from soldiers too stubborn to accept a reality that had already collapsed. Or there was complete silence, only the wind rolling down through the pines and the growl of truck engines in the distance. Nixon, Winter's closest friend and the veteran intelligence officer who had stayed with Easy Company from the very beginning, stumbled upon one of the most unexpected treasures of the entire war. When he reached Berchtesgaden, the enormous secret wine cellar of Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's field marshal and one of the most infamous and powerful figures in the Nazi Reich. The underground vault held thousands of bottles of the rarest and most expensive wines and spirits in Europe, plundered from France, Italy, Germany's most celebrated vineyards and beyond, looted across the long years of occupation. Nixon, legendary throughout Easy Company for his bottomless devotion to Vat 69 Scotch whiskey, stood before that monumental hoard and, for the first time in what felt like forever, broke into a genuinely satisfied smile. It was precisely these small, trivial moments, the flashes of humor and simple humanity threaded through the middle of enormous upheaval, that served as priceless medicine, giving the soldiers the strength to keep going. War is not made only of grand or tragic chapters. It is also woven from the image of soldiers laughing their heads off beside Göring's wine cellar, soldiers quietly sharing a last cigarette on a Bavarian mountaintop, and soldiers hunched over scraps of paper found in some abandoned villa, scribbling letters home. Those ordinary things were the most powerful proof of all that behind the worn and dusty uniforms, the essential human parts of each man were still intact.
On May 4th, 1945, Easy Company officially entered the center of Berchtesgaden. The town was nearly deserted. The grand estates that had once been the seat of the Nazi Reich's highest power now stood abandoned, their doors hanging open, rooms still cluttered with furniture and family photographs on the walls, SS uniforms still hanging neatly in the closets of men who had fled in haste. The Berghof, Hitler's main mountain headquarters on the slopes of the Obersalzberg, had been leveled by Royal Air Force bombs beforehand and was now nothing but a scorched heap of rubble, still smoldering faintly. Above Berchtesgaden, perched in a dramatically steep position nearly 1,900 meters above sea level, the Kehlsteinhaus, the legendary eagle's nest, waited for them in silence. But that would be tomorrow's story. That evening, the soldiers of Easy Company sat quietly inside Berchtesgaden, amid the wooden houses with their distinctive pointed Bavarian roof lines. They looked up at the high peaks surrounding them on all sides, and for the first time in what felt like a very long journey, realized they could no longer hear the sound of gunfire from any direction.
There was only the wind coming down from the snow-capped summits, the cheerful babble of a mountain stream through the rocks, and a sky full of alpine stars, brilliant and impossibly clear. Winters sat alone, lost in his own thoughts. He had no way of knowing that just 3 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had taken his own life in a bunker beneath Berlin, and that the 1,000-year Reich, which had once boasted it would rule the world, was living through its final convulsions. The soldiers of Easy Company, who 3 years earlier had assembled as green young men at Toccoa, had walked together through a journey that almost no one could have imagined when they stood at the starting line. They had crossed the vast expanse of the Atlantic, thrown themselves into the pitch-black night over Normandy, fought through the strangling bocage hedgerows, marched across the Netherlands, survived by some miracle at Bastogne, crossed the Rhine, and driven straight into the heart of Germany. And tomorrow, they would climb the final mountain.
Chapter 7. The Eagle's Nest, the Summit of a Journey. There are monuments so extraordinary that their architecture and commanding position alone lay bare the entire ambition and nature of the person who created them, standing defiant against time without needing a single word of explanation. Kehlsteinhaus is exactly such a place. The structure sits atop the peak of Kehlstein Mountain, deep in the Bavarian Alps, at a dizzying height of 1,834 meters above sea level, looking out with proud authority over the picturesque birch-sodden valley and the layers of snow-capped peaks surrounding it on all sides. The journey to reach this fortress is a sequence of breathtaking experiences in itself. A road nearly 6 kilometers cut directly through sheer limestone cliff face, leading into a tunnel 124 meters deep, bored straight into the heart of the mountain. And then a magnificent elevator, sheathed in polished brass with gilded mirror panels, rising straight up another 124 meters to emerge directly at the building's ground floor. What is astonishing is that this entire complex of roads, tunnels, and elevators was completed in under 13 months, from 1937 to 1938, at the cost of the sweat and lives of thousands of conscripted laborers working in brutal conditions, many of whom were left behind forever in the crevices of the mountain and never returned home. This magnificent structure was built on the secret orders of Martin Bormann, Hitler's scheming personal secretary and most powerful right-hand man, designed as an unprecedented birthday gift to present to the dictator on his 50th birthday in 1938. Bormann's ambition was unambiguous: to create an architectural wonder embodying the supreme power of the Reich, a place for receiving heads of state against a backdrop of such overwhelming natural grandeur that it would exert a crushing psychological pressure on anyone who set foot there. From a technical and aesthetic standpoint, Kehlsteinhaus is clearly a remarkable architectural achievement. But from a human standpoint, it is a moral stain, built on the bones of forced laborers and funded by resources ruthlessly plundered from the German people and the nation's ground beneath the Reich's occupation. And yet, there is a deeply ironic chapter in the story of the place the world calls the Eagle's Nest. Hitler himself utterly despised it. Throughout all the years of the Third Reich's rise and fall, the dictator visited Kehlsteinhaus barely 14 times, and most of those visits were driven by diplomatic obligation, receiving important international delegations, rather than personal desire. Hitler suffered from chronic acrophobia and claustrophobia, and being sealed inside a narrow elevator shaft nearly 130 meters long through frozen rock was a genuinely terrifying experience for him.
He also complained incessantly that the thin air on the wind-battered Alpine summit gave him splitting headaches and left him breathless. Because of this aversion, the people who enjoyed the luxury of Kehlsteinhaus most were the regime's senior officials, those who relished power and flocked there to feast, to rest, and to indulge in the heady feeling of gods looking down upon the world from its highest point. But regardless of whether Hitler loved or hated the place, Kehlsteinhaus stood as an unwavering symbol. It was the physical embodiment of a tyranny that wished to place itself above all others, to look down upon the rest of humanity from a height that ordinary mortals could never reach. And it was precisely because of that enormous symbolic weight that the moment an American unit marched to the top of this mountain carried a historic significance far beyond anything that could be captured in a dry military report. On the morning of May 5, 1945, the men of Easy Company quietly prepared for their final march up to Kehlsteinhaus. This was not a conventional military assault operation. Intelligence reports had confirmed that the elite SS soldiers guarding the fortress had fled in the night, hastily grabbing what they could and abandoning the entire compound. No significant resistance was anticipated. But on a battlefield, the phrase, "no significant resistance," has never been an ironclad guarantee of survival, and not a single warrior of Easy Company retained any innocence after all the losses they had endured. Richard Winters was not among those who climbed the mountain that day, not for lack of any desire to witness the victory, but because the supreme responsibility of a battalion commander required him to remain behind to coordinate the entire situation, establish security, and manage the countless crises still pressing down on Berchtesgaden and the surrounding area. That was the bitter price of command. You were obliged to stand back and let your brothers step forward to claim the glory. Louis Nixon quietly led a forward patrol up through the pine forests of Bavaria, still wrapped in morning mist. Ronald Spears walked beside him in silence. Behind them, Easy Company's men moved in single file. The mountain road twisted narrowly, hugging sheer rock faces with blind curves around every corner, positions that at any other point in the war would have been perfect ambush sites, capable of wiping out an entire company. But on that morning, everything was strangely, almost eerily still. There was only the wind off the rock faces and the steady rhythm of boots on pavement.
They walked the steep stretches of road on foot, then moved silently into the long tunnel bored through the mountain's core. Inside, the electrical lighting system was still on, casting a pale yellow glow over damp, slick stone walls. The air turned cold and close, carrying the particular smell of deep underground spaces. At the far end of the tunnel, the legendary elevator still operated smoothly, its brass interior and gilded mirror panels gleaming with the same ostentatious luxury that Bormann had so carefully arranged to dazzle the Führer's guests. The soldiers of Easy Company stepped into that lavish space in worn-out uniforms caked in mud and earth, boots streaked with the tracks of a long march, faces gaunt and unshaven, and looked around at their surroundings with expressions that held feelings no words could easily name. When the elevator doors slowly parted and they stepped out of the mountain's stone interior, an immense spectacle opened before them that no camera of that era could ever fully capture within its frame. Kehlsteinhaus perched on its solitary peak and looked out in an unobstructed panorama across all four directions. To the north, the Berchtesgaden Valley spread far into the distance, its small houses and green patchwork fields looking like toys from this height. To the south, the Alps marched to the horizon in an unbroken procession, their snow-covered peaks glittering in the morning sun. To the east lay the border of Austria.
The air above was so thin and clear that one had the sensation of being able to see straight through the curvature of the earth along the farthest edge of the horizon. Nixon stood in silence, taking in that vast open space for a few moments, then turned and walked purposefully inside the fortress. Beneath the roof of Kehlsteinhaus, everything seemed frozen exactly as it had been, as if no war had ever passed this way. Fine furniture of rare wood remained in its proper place. Masterworks hung undisturbed on the walls. Sets of exquisite porcelain rested untouched behind glass. And in the wine cellar below, thousands of bottles of the finest vintages plundered from across Europe stood in neat rows. The people who had once lived and taken their pleasures here had clearly believed so completely in their own invincibility that they could not conceive of the day when they would be forced to flee in disgrace and haste, unable to take anything with them. Nixon, the man who had endured the full trial of the war with his legendary running complaint that he could never find a bottle of his beloved Vat 69 whiskey, stood before the wine cellar of Kehlsteinhaus and went still for a moment. Then, with complete composure, he reached out, took a bottle of fine wine, opened it, and poured. It was not the mindless looting of ordinary conquerors. It was the unhurried ease of a soldier who had walked through uncounted deaths, survived by a fortune no one could explain, and now stood in the innermost sanctum of the common enemy, performing the most ordinary human act at the most historic moment of his life. Outside, on the windswept terrace of Kehlsteinhaus, a group of Easy Company soldiers stood in complete silence, looking out at the open expanse of sky and mountain. No one spoke for a long time. No historical record pinpoints exactly which soldier raised the American flag over this fortress. No formal ceremony was held. No military photographer was summoned to capture the moment for posterity. There was only an American flag, worn and faded by the same months of fire and mud that had worn everything else on their bodies, silently raised and left to fly over a place that 3 years ago, not one of these young men had ever dared to dream he might one day reach. Kehlsteinhaus fell silent and empty, not because no one wished to claim it. It was empty because the men who had spent so much blood and suffering to build it, the men who had sat here in arrogant certainty that they would reign atop the world forever, had vanished like soap bubbles. Some fled in hiding, some were led away in chains to face justice, and the Supreme One, the soul for whom this castle had been built, had ended his own life with a disgraced pistol shot in a dark underground bunker in Berlin just 3 days earlier, on April 30th, 1945, as the guns of the Soviet Red Army closed in within a few hundred meters. The 1,000-year Reich, in the end, had lasted exactly 12 years. The moment of standing on the eagle's nest carries a psychological weight that can only be fully understood by rolling back the entire reel of the journey from the very beginning. Back at Toccoa, those green young men punished their bodies, running up and down Mount Currahee every day until their feet bled raw. They learned to throw themselves out of aircraft doors into pitch-black night. They learned to fight and win while critically outgunned and undersupplied. And they learned to place their lives in the hands of the man beside them in moments so desperate that nothing else was left to hold on to. In Normandy, they had jumped into completely unknown territory in a terrifying night, with no way to find their bearings, not knowing where the enemy lay waiting, and they had found each other across the edge of life and death through the clicking of tiny metal crickets. And then 13 men had dared to attack and silence 4 fortified German artillery pieces. In Netherlands, they had held and protected vital roads that no one could promise they could keep, on flat, exposed ground with nowhere to hide, under the crushing pressure of relentless enemy assaults that never seemed to stop. At Bastogne, they had held their ground in -20-degree cold, without warm clothing, critically short of ammunition, with no promise of relief, and not one of them abandoned his foxhole.
And now those same men stood tall on the magnificent Alpine summit, inside the fortress their enemy had built to symbolize eternal power. And that enemy was now erased entirely from the living world. No triumphal march has ever been told through a truer or more extraordinary story than this. Ronald Spears stood alone on the balcony of Kehlsteinhaus for a long time, his eyes turned toward the endless white ridgelines of the Alps. He was a man no one in Easy Company had ever fully understood, a man whose past and the stories surrounding him were always wrapped in a veil of mystery, a man his subordinates feared more than they drew close to. But in that sacred moment on the high mountain, he was simply a young American soldier of Scottish blood, standing quietly in a beautiful alpine morning in early spring, with thoughts that perhaps only he would ever fully know. Nixon came out afterward, carrying a bottle of wine, and sat down easily on the terrace beside the other men. They passed the bottle between them and drank straight from it. No crystal glasses, no elaborate toasts, just weathered soldiers sharing a fine wine on the summit of a defeated enemy's mountain on a morning in May 1945. Down in the valley below, Winters received a brief military report that Kehlsteinhaus had been secured without resistance. He noted it calmly in his operations journal, then quietly turned back to the business of the day. That was Winters to the end. No ceremony, no display. He had no need to climb to the top of the highest mountain himself to confirm that a journey of thousands of miles had reached its end. He felt that truth deeply in his very blood, without needing to stand in that place to see it. There is a question that people have asked when reflecting on this historic moment. What did the men of Easy Company truly feel when they stood atop the Eagle's Nest? The answer, from the surviving witnesses themselves, through post-war interviews on film, through pages of faded journals, through handwritten letters sent home, was not the overwhelming elation or jubilant victory that one might imagine. There was no roaring in triumph, no tears of joy breaking loose. Most of them described the experience as a gentle emptiness, an absolute stillness deep inside the soul, a state of suspension that was not quite sadness, but could not honestly be called happiness either. It seemed as though they had traveled too far, witnessed and endured too much grief for their bodies to respond in the way the world assumes victory is supposed to look. Bill Guarnere and Joe Toye were not there. Their legs had been left forever in the frozen foxholes of Bastogne. And how many other brothers had never had the chance to come back from Normandy, from Carentan, from the Netherlands, or from the ice-cold pine forests of the Ardennes? Their names no longer answered at morning roll call on that high mountaintop, but through some invisible thread of connection, their presence was felt there still. And perhaps that was the heaviest thing the surviving soldiers carried in their hearts as they stood on the Eagle's Nest on that May morning in sun-bright Alps in May 1945. Kehlsteinhaus still stands there to this day, carefully preserved by the Bavarian authorities and open as a well-known historic tourist destination. Each year it welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world. They ride the old brass elevator, step out onto the terrace to take in the Alps, and sit with a cup of coffee inside the space that has been converted from the old Nazi regime's building into a restaurant. But perhaps very few of them know that on a historic spring morning in May 1945, a group of young men in the worn, mud-streaked uniforms of the United States Army once stood right where they stand now,
closing a great journey that began on a small, unremarkable mountain in Georgia called Karahi and ended in full glory on the summit of a collapsed empire. Now a great question stands before posterity. What was it that forged them? What was the force that transformed a collection of ordinary men born in different corners of America into a legendary unit whose story the world has never stopped telling with deep reverence 80 years on? The answer certainly does not lie in the sophistication of their weapons or the superiority of their military tactics. It lives in something far simpler, far less visible, and far harder to grasp. It lives in those sweat-soaked mornings running up Karahi when legs seemed ready to buckle and give out entirely, but a glance to the side showed a comrade still grinding forward with clenched teeth. It lives in the click of a small metal cricket sounding out in the pitch-black night over Normandy, and the overwhelming rush of relief when two faint clicks came back from a brother in the dark. It lives in the moment Guarnier, without a heartbeat of hesitation, threw himself out of the safety of his foxhole to drag Toy clear while artillery was still tearing up the ground around them. It lives in Rowe's footsteps, moving straight toward the sound of a desperate cry for help while stray rounds were still striking all around him. These are the qualities of the human spirit that no military order can compel, no regulation can enforce, and no one can sustain as a pretense for long. They can only be born and nurtured from a single source: absolute faith in the brother standing beside you, and the understanding that he is equally ready to place his life in your hands in exactly the same way. The warriors of Easy Company were not superheroes stepped out of mythology. They knew fear, they knew pain, they knew doubt, and they knew the complete exhaustion of being thrown into the worst storm of their age, just as any other mortal would. But what made them extraordinary was simply this: they still chose to stand up and do what needed to be done. Even when their bodies trembled with fear, their hearts bled with grief, their minds were besieged by doubt, and every last reserve of strength had been spent. In the end, that is the truest and most complete definition of courage, a priceless legacy that the story of this band of brothers leaves the world forever.